Hello and welcome to this video for basic sentential logic and formal fallacies and cognitive biases. This video covers material that's in chapter 1 of the text, in particular material that's in section 1.2.6, and the topic is just the conditional statement operator. The conditional operator in English, the two big ways or main ways this is expressed, two of the main ways are illustrated here. If you earn exactly 900 points, then you will get some form of A. That just means an A plus, an A or an A minus. So if something, then something. In English, you can leave out the then. I can say if you earn exactly 900 points, you will get some form of A. Now, conditionals are challenging to translate compared to disjunctions and conjunctions, the other two-place statement operators. And the reason is that the order of the components isn't reversible. They're not order invariant. Whereas conjunctions and disjunctions, they are order invariant. You can reverse the order of the components. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at the statement, roses are red and violets are blue. We can reverse the order of those components and it isn't changing the meaning. Violets are blue and roses are red. Now, a quick footnote here. Even though those mean the same thing, you should translate them correctly. So for instance, roses are red and violets are blue. If I assign R to roses are red and V to violets are blue, I would translate this as R dot V. Now, when I said that they're reversible, what that means is that this actually means the same thing as V dot R, right? Violets are blue and roses are red. They mean the same thing. That's true. But it's still the case that if we're just translating the English, this is the correct translation because the English had R as the first conjunct and V as the second conjunct. So if we're going to translate them, we should translate it that way. Not because it's a change of meaning, but just because that's how the original English was. So we're not going to do it that way. It's also the case that you shouldn't translate it this way, right? This means the same thing. If we sort of negate V 4 times, roses are red, and it's false that it's not true that violets aren't not blue, right? That so not V means the same thing as V, but that's not what the original English said, right? So if we're going to translate it that way. So don't do this either. But the meaning is the same. This and this and this do mean the same thing logically, but still translate them in the correct way. Same thing with disjunction. You can switch the order without changing the meaning. So I could say the Cavs or the Warriors will win, or I could say the Warriors or the Cavs will win. So switching the order of the disjuncts in a disjunction also doesn't change the meaning. And in this way, conjunction and disjunction are like some of the arithmetic operators. So addition is also order invariant. 5 plus 3 is the same as 3 plus 5, and 2 times 7 is the same as 7 times 2. But of course, not all arithmetic operators are like that. So subtraction isn't order invariant. Order matters. 5 minus 3 isn't the same thing as 3 minus 5. And 2 divided by 7 isn't the same as 7 divided by 2. So for some operators, arithmetic operators and logical operators, statement operators, order does matter. So here's an illustration. If you are a billionaire, then you can afford donuts. Doesn't mean the same thing as if you can afford donuts, then you are a billionaire. Okay, that's a different meaning. Okay. Hopefully that's intuitively obvious. Now, since the order of the components of a conditional isn't reversible, we're going to need different names for those two components. We didn't with disjunctions and conjunctions. We could just call them both disjuncts or call them both conjuncts. But we need two different names for conditionals. So we're going to call the two components the antecedent and the consequent. and we're going to use the horseshoe as our symbol for the conditional. And in our formal notation, the antecedent is always going to go on the left and the consequent's always going to go on the right. So in our formal notation, it's always going to look like this. Antecedent on the left, horseshoe, consequent on the right. Okay, so far so good. Now given that, there's going to be 3 steps to translating a conditional from our formal notation, or from natural language, English in this case, into the formal notation. Step 1 is just determining that the English statement is a conditional, as opposed to a disjunction or conjunction or atomic statement or whatever. Once we've figured out that it's a conditional, we have to determine which component is the antecedent and which one is the consequent. Now, when I said the antecedent's always on the left and the consequent is always on the right, that's in the formal notation. We always put the antecedent on the left and the consequent on the right. In English, that's not the case, and that's what makes conditionals difficult, is the English sometimes has the antecedent first and sometimes has it last. Okay? We'll see what that means shortly. But in any case, after you figured out that the English statement is a conditional, you have to determine which of the components is the antecedent and which is the consequent. Then once you've figured that out, in our formal notation, we'll put the antecedent on the left, then horseshoe, then consequent on the right. So these are the steps to go through for translating a conditional. So let's look at step 1. How do we know that we're dealing with a conditional? Well, there's going to be more ways that I'll talk about in the optional material for those students who are doing that. But the main ways in the core material are if then, so if A then B. You can also have if and then just skip the then. So I can say if G H. Sometimes the if isn't at the beginning. I can say K if L. And then sometimes you can use only if, M only if N. Now, so far we haven't talked about which of these components in any of these is the antecedent and which is the consequent. All we know so far is that if we're dealing with an if then or an if in not at the beginning or an only if, then it's a conditional. And in fact, the key of all of these is the word if is showing up there. So that'll be the big clue. In the optional material, again, there'll be some ways of expressing conditional that don't use any form of if. Okay, so next up, we know we're dealing with a conditional. How can you tell which of the components, and by that I mean A or B, G or H, K or L or M or N, which of those in each case is the antecedent and which is the consequent? Well, there's 2 possibilities if you look back at the 4 options I gave you. One is that the English is using just if. It's not only if, but it's if. Maybe there's a then, maybe not, and maybe the if is at the beginning, but maybe it's not, but if is by itself. The other possibility is that the expression is only if. Okay, and we have to do these differently. So first let's talk about situations where in English English just uses if by itself, meaning it's not part of the only if expression. Maybe there's a then, doesn't matter. Maybe it's at the beginning, doesn't matter. What matters is that it's not only if, it's just if. Well, in that case, whatever statement immediately follows the if is the antecedent, and the other one, wherever it is going to be the consequent. Okay, so for example, if the statement is if P then Q, notice it's if, that tells us it's a conditional, and it also means that it's not only if, it's just if. So it's if it's just if by itself, not part of only, the statement immediately following the if is the antecedent. So here that means P is the antecedent. The other component, in this case Q, will be the consequent. Okay? Now in our formal notation, recall, we always put the antecedent on the left and the consequent on the right. So P, because P is the antecedent, we're putting it on the left in the formal notation, then horseshoe, and then Q because it's the consequent. Okay? Next example, if A, B. Well, the first thing to note is that we have the word if there, so it's conditional. And it's if by itself. It's not only if, it's just if. So it's the same thing. It's if by itself. So we look at if. What's the statement following if? A is that statement. So A is the antecedent, B is the consequent, and antecedent in the formal notation shows up on the left, consequent on the right. So it's A horseshoe B. Now the issue here is that if you looked at the previous two examples, you might think, oh, well, look, the order of the formal notation is always the same as the order in English. Well, for if, then, and if, yeah. But what about this case? C if D. Okay, well, remember, same thing. Find the if and see if the word only is right next to it, if it's only if. And here it's not. It's still just if by itself. So we follow the same rule. The component following the if is the antecedent. Well, what follows the if? D does. So D is the antecedent here. The other component is the consequent. So here C is the consequent. So in the formal notation, antecedent always goes on the left. So D is the antecedent, so we're going to put that on the left. D goes on the left. C, the consequent, goes on the right. So here, this is an example where the linear order in the formal notation is different from the linear order in the English. Okay, now what if English uses only if? All of the examples we've looked at so far were if by itself, meaning if, not only if, but just if. If the expression is only if, then the statement immediately following only if is the consequent, and the other statement is the antecedent. So if I say K only if L, I first just recognize that it's only if. It's not if by itself. And then the rule is if it's only if, the statement following only if is the consequent. The other statement will be the antecedent. So in the formal notation, because antecedents always go on the left, I have K horseshoe L. So let's do some examples. If you are a billionaire, then you can afford to buy donuts. So atomic statements should be pretty clear. You are a billionaire, you can afford to buy donuts. I rewrite this, I get if B, comma, then D. I'm always going to leave any commas or punctuation in at this stage because they might help me determine what main operators are. In this case, there's only one operator, so it turns out that's not a problem. But still, I'm just going to get into the habit of always leaving commas in here. Well, so I know it's a conditional because it's the word if is there. And it's if by itself. It's not part of only if. Well, what does that tell me? So it's conditional, so I'm going to have a horseshoe. What I'm going to do is now I have to determine, well, what's the antecedent? That's going to go here. What's the consequent? That's going to go there. Okay, well, it's if by itself. So the expression or the statement following the if is the antecedent. And in this case, that's B. So B will be the antecedent. So it's going to go there. The other statement, in this case, D is the consequent, and it's going to go on the right. So I will end up with B horseshoe D. Let's do another example. The sidewalks will get wet if it rains. What are the atomic statements? The sidewalks will get wet and it rains. So it's just called those S and R. So I'll rewrite the original sentence, S if R. And now, how are we going to translate this? Well, we know it's a conditional because the word if is showing up. Okay. And in particular, it's if by itself. It's not only if. So I'm going to look and see what statement follows if. Well, in this case, it's R. So R is going to be in this the antecedent. The statement following if is always the antecedent. So R is the antecedent. And in the formal notation, the antecedents always go on the left. So it's going to be, and the other statement will be the consequent. So I have R horseshoe S. Next example. You can make bread only if you have flour. Atomic statements, you can make bread, you have flour. And if I plug those back in, I have B only if F. Well, here we're dealing with only if. It's still got the word if in it, so we know it's a conditional. But we have a different rule, since it's only if, for determining what's the antecedent and what's the consequent. Remember, the rule is the statement following only if is the consequent. Well, what follows only if? F does. So F will be the consequent. Other statement is the antecedent. And so it'll be B horseshoe F. Okay. Now I'm just going to summarize this. In English, when we're dealing with conditionals, which statement is the antecedent and which is the consequent is not coded by linear order. Okay. Which one shows up at the beginning of the sentence and which one shows up at the end isn't how you tell logically which is acting like the antecedent and which one is acting like the consequent. Rather, English uses adjacency to some key words. Okay, which component appears right after the if, or which one appears right after only if. So to tell which is the antecedent and which is the consequent in natural language, you ignore the left-right order. You don't care which one shows up first. What you do is you look for those keywords and you see which components show up next to those keywords or immediately following those keywords. And in particular, for conditionals using just if, not only if, so if by itself, the statement following if is the antecedent and the other one, which may or may not be preceded by a then, is going to be the consequent. If it's only if, the expression or the statement that immediately follows only if is the consequent and the other one is the antecedent. So that's how in the English you tell which is which. But on our notation, we don't use adjacency to anything. We do use linear order. We always put the antecedent first, or on the right of the horseshoe, and we always put the consequent. We always put the antecedent on the left of the horseshoe and the consequent on the right of the horseshoe. So in the notation, we do use linear order to code antecedent and consequent. Okay, this video is the last for Chapter 1 that goes over statement operators. In the next video, we're going to start just going through examples of translating compound statements